Well, I think humanity defines it collectively, like so many good things in science. Science is evidence-based, controlled inquiry with reflection on the evidence, and it's setting explanation in terms of hypotheses and theories that form a unified, comprehensive reticulation.
Thank you for that. Jonathan, do you have anything to add to that, or from your understanding?
So science comes from the Latin scientia, which means knowledge, and the scientific method starts with an observation, and you form a hypothesis to account for that observation, and you set out to test that observation, and it either turns out to be false or turns out to be true. And for something to qualify as a scientific theory, it should be testable, repeatable, falsifiable, and so that's what we normally mean by science.
But I'm not sure that in the long term every proposition in science will be falsifiable. I agree that that's our current paradigm.
Yeah. So I agree. So Karl Popper's criteria of falsification has come under some scrutiny from philosophers of science. It does have some shortcomings, but it's generally a good guide anyway. That's a lengthy discussion, so we won't go into that.
They were incomplete scientists. I mean, anyone...
What does that mean? Yeah, what does that mean? What does that mean, incomplete?
I was about to say. I think they were deploying the scientific method, but they didn't have full confidence in it. That's what I mean by incomplete. There was not enough science around until really the 20th century for people fully to divest themselves of the thought that there might be a God behind it all. It's only in the 20th and 21st centuries that we have realized that the hypothesis of God is not necessary. And so any modern day practitioner of science can be called a scientist, in my view, only if they do not depend upon superstition as an augmentation of their understanding.
So just coming back to you on that, Peter, if that's the case, can we take anything of note or credibility from these incomplete scientists?
Oh yeah, absolutely. But they weren't rounded, as it were. They did fantastic work, and they built the foundations of what we know today. But they did not realize this abnegated the hypothesis of God.
John, do you have anything to comment on that?
I just have a few things to say in relation to that. One is that I think in the 21st century, we actually have far more reason to believe in God than at any point in human history. So, for instance, in the 20th century, the mainstream cosmological model was the steady state theory, which maintained that the universe was eternal in the past. And that came under intense challenge, first with Albert Einstein and his theories of general relativity. And Einstein's equations, of course, showed that the universe had a definite beginning to time and space. And, of course, he invoked the cosmological constant as a fudge factor in his equations to try and evade the reality of a space-time beginning. He later went on to call that the greatest blunder in his career. Other evidences piled in, such as Edwin Hubble. He looked through his Hubble telescope and observed that the galaxies are shifted towards the red end of the spectrum, which is called the redshift. And basically, it's evidence for the galaxies receding away from us at a speed proportional to their distance in every direction. And so the universe itself is expanding over time. And that persuaded Einstein that indeed the universe seems to have a cosmic beginning. Furthermore, there's the second law of thermodynamics, which shows that the universe is running out of usable energy. And if the universe were past eternal, then we'd have already run out of usable energy, but we haven't, and so it suggests that the universe is finite. Furthermore, it's only in the last less than a century that we've discovered the fine-tuning of the laws and constants of physics. It's only since the 1950s that we've really come to understand the information content of the cell. And so I think people are far more without excuse for not believing in God than any other point in human history.
What a pessimistic view. I mean, the fact that the universe has a beginning is an interesting, solvable problem. The fact that it is infinite makes I really can't conceive of something that exists forever, and has existed forever, but I can conceive of an entity that comes into existence. Certainly we don't know how it came into existence. Certainly we don't know what caused the inception, if cause means anything. But at least we've now got a problem to solve. And instead of throwing up our hands and say, this is a complication, we've now got a clear target of understanding.
But the fact that the universe had a beginning is far more surprising on an atheistic view of things than on a theistic view.
Speak for yourself.
Well, would you not agree that it's far more at home in an atheistic universe if the universe is eternal?
No, I think it's very interesting that this universe came into existence. We're working back in our knowledge through the study of the fundamental particles and through theoretical investigation. And we've got back to within incredible tiny fractions of a second after the inception of the universe. And we know more now because of the efforts that have been made over the last 100 years than the Bible told us in 2,000 years. But there is still that final step to take. And we're not going to say, oh, God did it, or oh, this is an insurmountable problem. We're going to say, we are accumulating expertise, and we, in due course, will have an explanation.
Peter, is there any idea of timescale you could give to when you think this bit of information is going to be found based on the last 100 years of rapid development in science? Can you say the next 100 years? Or?
The problems are getting harder and harder. We've solved many of the simpler problems. It's incredibly complicated, and it might involve various paradigm shifts, just as general relativity involved changing our ideas of the nature of space and time. And so, who knows? But you don't get many geniuses in every century. And we've had a couple in this century, in the 20th century. Maybe there's one being born now. But no, I can't predict. I'd like it to be within my lifetime, but who knows?
Well, do you think that will happen in the next 100 years?
Explaining the origin of the universe by natural means? No, because explaining the origins of nature requires invocation of something beyond nature. If the universe came into being from zero spatial volume, if it came into being from nothing, Aristotle had a great definition of nothing. Nothing is what rocks dream about, right? Nothing is nothing. Out of nothing, nothing comes. And every worldview ultimately must go back to some unmoved mover, some uncaused cause that exists out of the necessity of its own nature. Because every type of thing in the world exists either as a result of being brought into existence by some independent cause, or it exists out of the necessity of its own nature. For example, numbers and the laws of logic didn't begin to exist, they weren't brought into being, but they exist out of self-necessity. Likewise, I would maintain that, I would say that the universe cannot be something which exists necessarily, because it began to exist, it's contingent. And so whatever begins the chain of cause and effect must be necessary cause and non-contingent.
Well, let me say one very short thing, which I don't want to boast, but read a couple of my books where I explore the possibility of using scientific precepts to account for the coming into existence of the universe without intervention from absolutely nothing. That's all I'll say about that. I have written about it. Secondly, are you sure there's anything here at all anyway? I mean, let me very quickly, I'll only take half a moment to do this. If you were to count up the amount of energy in the universe, and you would get, you think there's a vast amount. And where did it all come from? But if you were to do the calculation properly, allowing for the energy that is represented by the mass of galaxies, and allowing for the energy that is tied up in the gravitational attraction between galaxies, I think that sum is zero. So I think before the universe came into existence, there was no energy. I think now there is no energy. Perhaps a simpler analogy is electric charge. Before the universe came into existence, there was no electric charge. We know there is electric charge now. We can see it all around us. But experimentally, we know that the amount of positive charge in the universe is exactly equal to the amount of negative charge. If it were not, then the universe would have blasted itself apart before gravitation had a chance to control it. So the net charge is still zero. So there is no electric charge. The event that took place at the inception of the universe is the separation of absolutely nothing into opposites. Now, that doesn't explain how that happened. It doesn't explain what actually went on, but it does show that there is a simpler question to answer than many theologians think there is.
So I hope everyone caught Dr. Atkins' response to the cosmological argument. His response is to deny the premise that the universe began to exist, because according to Dr. Atkins, the universe doesn't exist. There's nothing here.
No, I didn't say that. I said the difference between absolutely nothing and now is that we have a much more interesting form of absolutely nothing.
And much more interesting form of absolutely nothing. You heard that right.
We're going to move on to the next question here.
But the audience should not underestimate the power of science to simplify the questions and identify the real questions that need to be answered, rather than just saying, oh, Jesus, or oh, God.
If I have £10 in my wallet and I owe Dr. Atkins £10, that does not mean I have £0 in my wallet. Anyway. Yeah, so
in a few minutes, if that's all right.
Yeah.
I know you could talk about this.
Yeah, I could literally talk for hours, but I'll try and keep my comments succinct. I believe that the Bible is the Word of God. I believe it's inspired. I think there's evidence for that. For example, the evidence of predictive prophecy in Scripture. I'll just give one example, and that's from the book of Isaiah in chapter 53. We start from Isaiah 52:13. Actually, I'll start from Isaiah 53, because I don't want to read the whole text, so it'll take too long. So it says, "Who's believed what he has heard from us, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray, we have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all." And this, I've just read a small section of this text. It goes on, please read it for yourself later. But this is written 700 years before the coming of Jesus. Right? This is not a New Testament passage, this is an Old Testament passage. And so we've got predictive prophecies that are fulfilled in the person, and only in the person, of Jesus of Nazareth. Final argument I'll make, and then I'll close, is the argument from what I call messianic convergence, which is where we see correspondences between the gospel portrayals of Jesus' life and the Old Testament in a manner that points away from chance coincidence and to design. And I'll give an example, and that is, it's a remarkable coincidence that Jesus' death just so happens, coincidentally, to be at the time of Passover. Given the theological import of Jesus' life and ministry and death and resurrection, and Paul in 1 Corinthians 5 describes Jesus as the Passover lamb, that points to design. And yet we have overwhelming evidence that Jesus really was killed at the time of Passover. And so as a cumulative argument from looking at instances that we can, one, confirm historically, and two, show this correspondence with the Old Testament, we can actually build a very powerful cumulative argument for the, divine orchestration, because we have three contending hypotheses. One is coincidence, one is human manipulation of the account to make it converge with the Old Testament, and thirdly is divine orchestration. Given, I think the coincidence is ruled out by the probabilistic argument. I think that the human manipulation argument is ruled out by the fact that we can confirm many of these points of contact historically. And so that leaves divine orchestration as the best, most plausible explanation of those points of contact between the gospel portrayals of Jesus' life and the Hebrew Bible.
Utter nonsense. I think...
Do you have anything to add to that?
I mean, I suppose I should be more academic. The view could be taken that the New Testament was reverse engineered to fit the Old Testament.
Okay. Can I respond to that? Or
have you got a few minutes to respond to that?
Yeah,
Very
okay. So this is the human orchestration hypothesis, or the human manipulation hypothesis I mentioned. And in the case of Jesus' death at Passover, we have overwhelming evidence. We have the four Gospels. We have the book of Acts, which mentions the day of Pentecost, which is 50 days after Passover and so forth. We also have the Apostle Paul, who mentions Christ as the Passover lamb. We also have some indication in the Jewish Talmud that Jesus dies around the time of Passover, which is a non-Christian source. Another example which correlates with the Old Testament is Jesus' entrance into Jerusalem 5 days before Passover, which corresponds to, in Exodus 12, the fact that the Jews were to select their Passover lamb 5 days before Passover. And bring it into their homes. And so Jesus enters the city of Jerusalem exactly 5 days before Passover, according to John chapter 12. Very, very quickly, I'll try and do this in less than a minute, I would make an historiographical argument that Jesus really did enter into Jerusalem 5 days before Passover, thus eliminating the human manipulation hypothesis. If you look at John chapter 12, we read that 6 days before the Passover, Jesus therefore came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. In verse 12, it says, the next day he rides into Jerusalem on the back of a donkey. So John is the only gospel that tells us that Jesus enters Jerusalem 5 days before Passover. Now, if we go over to the Gospel of Mark, in chapter 11, Mark chapter 11, this is the parallel account of the triumphal entry. Now, Mark telescopes the narrative. He doesn't mention Jesus' entrance at Bethany the night before, and then in the morning he rides into Jerusalem. He just says he approaches Bethany, and then he sends the disciples to get the colt to ride into Jerusalem. But we can actually count off the days from that extraneous detail given to us in John. So assuming John's chronology, if we look at verse 11 of Mark 11, it says, he entered Jerusalem and went into the temple, and when he looked around everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. Assuming John's chronology to be correct, that's the end of 5 days before Passover. Then verse 12, on the following day when they came from Bethany, he was hungry, beginning of 4 days before Passover. Verse 19, when evening came, they went out of the city, end of 4 days before Passover. Verse 20, as they passed by in the morning, etc., beginning of 3 days before Passover. Then in chapter 13, you have the Olivet Discourse, where Jesus talks to his disciples on the Mount of Olives. I'm almost finished. I'm almost finished.
I find
on
this
the Mount of
tedious.
Olives.
This is tedious beyond extreme.
We've got a question coming for you in a minute.
Okay, I'll be 15 seconds. So he talks to his disciples on the Mount of Olives, and the Mount of Olives is midway between Jerusalem, where he's been all day, and Bethany, where his accommodation is for the night. So he's on his way home, we can fairly assume, for the evening, the end of 3 days before Passover. Then you turn over to chapter 14, verse 1, and it says it was now 2 days before the Passover, exactly where you would expect it on the hypothesis of historicity, thus pointing to design. So
there is no word in the Bible that you think is not true?
I think there are examples of, so I would make a distinction between errors that are good faith errors that are the product of good faith mistakes, lapse in memory or something like that, and deliberate distortions of fact.
So which of the two Genesis stories is true?
Sorry?
Which of the two Genesis stories?
So I assume you're referring to...
No, I don't want you to read that stuff.
Well,
it's boring in the extreme.
So do you want me to address that point or not?
Well, are they both true?
Yes, they're both true.
Okay, so there are two different stories which have completely different outcomes.
That's not true.
And they are both true. It's typical of the Bible.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to move on to the next question.
Well, we did have that question sort of in a different form during the presentations, and I think you might have raised it, Jonathan. But I think if some evil had somehow worked its way into the evolution of society, then we would now accept that it was morally correct. So I'm afraid okay. I have to stick with
Thank you for
that. But happily, societies don't entertain hypothetical histories.
Thank you for that, Dr. Atkins.
Well,
was that okay?
Yes,
Did that come across?
Effectively, you're accusing me of arguing from ignorance when it comes from asserting that religion is untenable as a mode of understanding. It's that kind of thing, isn't it? Well, it'd be a waste of time, frankly. Why read fairy stories when you're an adult? And frankly, most biblical stories are fairy stories. I'm afraid that the church fathers, St. Augustine and whoever, although they wrote wonderful things and kept the flame of literature alive, they actually wasted their time.
So I'm asking, why do you think it's worth your time to be here doing this and that?
Sorry, what's that bit?
Why do you think it's worth your time being here to converse about this topic?
From a very personal viewpoint, to keep Alzheimer's disease at bay.
Well, okay, that's...
But if that isn't an adequate answer, then it's to undermine religious attitudes, to propagate the beauty of and wonder of science.
So perhaps, if I could rephrase, do you think you'd be more effective in doing so if you had an understanding of the theological literature?
No, not in the least. I think if one needs a profound understanding of what science has achieved and is capable of achieving, I don't need to waste my time on old-fashioned, outdated fairy stories.
And how old does it have to be outdated? I mean, some of the greatest scientific writings in history come from
Yes. If we were to look at it as even, I guess the way I guess it's being posited is if we were to look at other areas of history, if we looked at the Roman history, Greco-Roman Empire, is it worth studying that?
Oh yes.
And what can we take from that? In fact,
I think to understand societies in the basis of evidence, in this case history, written history, authenticated history, if you like, and sometimes speculated history, is very helpful for understanding modern society and where it's going and how it got here. But I don't think the stream of knowledge that is represented by religion helps in any way the stream of knowledge that is represented by science.
Yeah.
But I know the attitudes. I know the attitudes, and I know how people think, and I know what people say. And and on occasions like this, one discovers how people think. And I think, as you discover how I think. So, there's plenty of opportunities, rather than wasting one's time studying in verse by verse detail the Bible.
We're going to go to our next question now. Thank you for that. We've got one over here, just by the wall. Do you want to just say the question?
They're getting harder to discover. They're not more complex when you actually have discovered them. They actually simplify one's understanding of the world. I think quantum theory, in some respects, simplifies our understanding of the world. I think that relativity, in some respects, also simplifies our understanding of the world. After all, take general relativity. I mean, just a simple example. That it was very difficult to know what gravitation was. But through general relativity, we discover that it simply warped space-time. And that, in my view, is a great simplification of our understanding of the fabric of reality.
Jonathan, what would you say to that question?
I'll speak to my own area of expertise, which is biology. I mean, it's absolutely clear that the complexity of biological systems has increased stupendously over time. I mean, when Darwin was alive, the cell, to quote Thomas Henry Huxley, was essentially a homogeneous glob of protoplasm. And fundamentally simple in nature. Whereas what we now know about the cell is that the cell is chock full of nanotechnology and information processing, storage, and retrieval processes. And it was a lot easier when Darwin was alive to believe that natural selection could explain the appearance of design without recourse to a designer than it is in the modern world where we've had the genomic revolution. We understand the nature of DNA, we understand the nature of the sequence hypothesis, and the nanotechnology and molecular machines that governs the world of the cell.
But I still think that is a progress towards simplicity, even though the outcome of all these simplicities is very complex. The fact that we understand the underlying simplicities is what science is all about.
I think there's a difference there in what's simple, what we mean by simplicity there. Is there any other questions from the floor? Wow, quite a few. I'll go with you, if you'd like to stand up and ask your question.
So I'm glad you asked that question. Thanks for asking that. There's a common misconception. Oh, I'm sorry. Do you want to, I'll repeat the question. Okay. So the question was, if we were to take out a Quran and read, there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his messenger, which is the Shahada, would that be evidence for Islam being true? And the argument was, am I being a hypocrite here because I'm appealing to the Bible to justify the Bible as the Word of God? Am I being circular in my argument here? And this actually is a fundamental misunderstanding, I think, on the part of many atheists. I recently debated my friend Alex O'Connor, who's in the audience here with us today. And I often read through some of the comments on the YouTube video after the debate goes on the internet. And there were a lot of atheists there who accused me there on that occasion of quoting the Bible to prove the Bible, and therefore reasoning in a circle. I think it's perfectly legitimate to quote the Bible in order to provide evidence for the Bible, if you do it in the right way. What I'm doing when I'm using the Bible as evidence is I'm showing patterns which are best explained on the hypothesis of historicity, or on the hypothesis of divine inspiration, or something like that. So in the example I gave, establishing that Jesus enters Jerusalem 5 days before Passover, I actually showed a pattern of evidence which is most consistent with that hypothesis and best explained by that hypothesis, and so forth. There are historical tools that we can apply, and historical methodologies that we can apply to evaluating historical documents, because it's incontrovertible that the New Testament and the Bible at large are a collection of historical documents that were compiled over about 1,500 years by 30 plus different authors, and we can evaluate them in the same way that we evaluate other historical documents. We can look at external points of confirmation or disconfirmation. We can look at how they illuminate one another, and so forth. So that's what I say to that.
Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for the question.
A Muslim would say the same about the Quran, wouldn't they? So we don't trust.
Sorry, say that again?
A Muslim would say the same about Islam.
Yeah, and I would dispute their arguments. I mean, they would have to argue that. I'm very familiar with Islam. I've debated many Muslim scholars, and I'm familiar with how they argue, and I'm just not persuaded by their arguments. But I am persuaded by arguments for Christianity.
Okay, we're going to move on to our next and final question of the evening. If we go to gentleman down here, please.
As I said, he goes beyond the evidence. So I don't think. But I think we're talking about the lack of belief, not to affirm belief.
Whichever it is, should students be required to confirm it
No,
before being accredited?
no, absolutely not. Because there's room in this world for the way for individual thought and attitudes, and they're all different, and some of them are productive and others are not, and it's up to the individual to find their mode of comprehension. So I deplore the possibility that people purporting to be science still are driven by superstition. But I wouldn't shut them in lunatic asylums.
But obviously, I have said many, many times throughout this debate that I'm a theist, and I believe in the God of the Bible because I'm persuaded by the public evidence, the publicly accessible evidence, that Christianity is objectively true. I am persuaded of the reality of design and nature having looked at the scientific data. So it's not, I mean, even if Dr. Atkins disagrees with my conclusions, that doesn't disqualify me from being a scientist, because I'm sure that Peter Atkins has read papers by scientists, even Nobel laureates, whom he disagrees with on some issues.
But you're an incomplete scientist, is my view.
Okay.
A complete scientist would not rely on superstition for half his way through life.
What do you mean by superstition?
Religious belief.
And what do you mean by religious belief?
Superstition.
Okay.
That sounds circular to me.
Okay, this is the definition of a circular argument, okay?
Well, I think on that note, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to end the Q&A and end this evening. It's going to be the formal end to the conversation. However, we will be, for those who are interested, continuing